All right, this is biology lesson 3.04. In this lesson, we're going to take kind of an overview of how things get across the cell membrane, or as we like to call it, membrane transport. And this gives us all of the different types of transport that you need to know by the end of the chapter. You needed to know a few things, like you needed to know what diffusion was and concentration. So for us to talk about this intelligently. All right, but let's go ahead and get started. So we divide membrane transport into two categories. So this is a flow chart. You're going to go one way or the other. So we can have passive transport or we can have active transport. Passive transport, so let's write some bullet points with this. Passive transport occurs naturally. It'll happen whether we want it to or not. So for example, we talked in the last lesson about diffusion and how if we have an area of high concentration, things always try to go from high to low. So it occurs naturally because nature's trying to balance things out. It does not require energy input. But it must have a concentration gradient. If things become equal or if the concentration gradient stops or spreads out, this will stop. So you have to have a difference in concentration. We have two categories of passive transport. We have facilitated diffusion and we have diffusion. So let's talk about facilitated diffusion first, and I'll put a little blue. And we'll come over here to diffusion. The difference is, we talked about diffusion. Diffusion is going to happen, and it's going to happen directly across the membrane. Let's make diffusion light blue. So the substances that move with diffusion can go directly across the membrane, or directly through the membrane. But with facilitated diffusion, these are larger substances. And so if you facilitate something, and it means you help out, it means if you facilitate the discussion in your government class, you helped the discussion out. So the facilitator here is a protein. So here the substances have to go through a protein. So do you remember that protein channel we saw? That's an example of facilitated diffusion. So this is going directly across the membrane, out to in, but this is going through a protein. But they're both passive. Even though you're going through a protein, it still depends on concentration gradient. So important. Okay, we have three substances that can go across through diffusion. So we have simple diffusion and we have osmosis. Osmosis is its own category, and osmosis is the diffusion of water. And this is special. So this special things happen when we talk about osmosis. So we give it its own category. So who are our other compounds that can simply diffuse across? Well, first of all, they have to be very small. The reason some of these other compounds can't get through the membrane, they need a protein, is because they're too large. So this is usually, we can say 2 over here. These are smaller substances. And we could say these are larger substances. Larger substances. So there are 3 compounds that can get through, and osmosis, water gets its own category. We call that osmosis. But think about one of the things we haven't focused on a lot yet are the compounds that we need to stay alive. If you held your breath and you held it for too long, you'd pass out. But if you couldn't get your breath, why would it eventually kill you? Because you don't have oxygen. So we have to have oxygen, and we write oxygen as O2, and we have to get rid of carbon dioxide, CO2. And these guys are small enough, they can just go right through the membrane, which is good because we need that to happen. So if it's water that's diffusing, we call that osmosis. So what are we talking about? What compounds go across with facilitated diffusion? We have glucose, and glucose is a relatively, even though it's a monomer, even though it's a monosaccharide, it's kind of a big molecule. We also have ions, something called ions, and these are sodium, chloride. There's others. So so these are all of our passive transports. We have simple diffusion, the carbon dioxide. You know what we're going to do? We're going to split this up. We're going to do active transport overview before we get into active transport. So we need to do a lesson on osmosis, and we need to do a lesson on facilitated diffusion. So let's just wrap this up here. All right, so we've got passive transport, active transport. Let's talk about the difference there before we close this out. So active transport requires energy input. And what's the energy we use? Well, guys, remember in the last chapter and in the chapter before that, I told you there's one thing we're going to talk about over and over, and that is ATP. The other thing we're going to say, and I'll explain this more later, but this moves things against the concentration gradient. Against the concentration gradient. We're going to leave that. I know that's not, there's not an explanation for that yet, but I just wanted to get that noted out. All right, so this gives us an overview of what we're talking about. We've already talked about regular diffusion, simple diffusion. So this was in the last lesson. The next one's going to be osmosis, and then we'll do facilitated diffusion, and then we'll move on to active transport. Okay, thanks for watching. Have a good day.